Welcome everybody to our fourth annual Cotterell lecture in sociological jurisprudence. It's a horrible evening, so thank you all very much for coming out on it. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here, hosting with Queen Mary School of Law, of course, and the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. I'm one of its 4 directors, Isabel Ruler. There's Max Delmar, who is responsible for all the hard work. I'm just kind of standing and chatting. Ava Nanopoulos at the back, and Noam Gur, who we're all absolutely delighted to welcome you all this evening. The lectures are in honour of our own Professor Roger Cotterell, who's sitting here in the middle of the room. Just wanted to embarrass him. And we're absolutely delighted to be able to honour him this evening. And to celebrate such a leading light in socio-legal research, it's entirely fitting that we should invite a luminary from the field this evening. And it's delightful to be able to introduce Annelies Riles this evening. She is a professor of law and anthropology, and this autumn she left Cornell University to take up a new position as executive director of the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Studies at Northwestern University in the US. Of course, we all know her writing very well on global financial markets, comparative law, conflict of laws, and human rights. So really socio-legal research par excellence. Because she's a professor of law and a professor of anthropology, really kind of talking interdisciplinarity. Professor Riles has written extensively on these topics. Her latest book is Financial Citizenship, Experts, Publics, and the Politics of Central Banking, which came out with Cornell University Press this summer. And it follows on the heels of many other books, including Collateral Knowledge in 2011, Documents, Artifacts of Knowledge in 2006, and The Network Inside Out in 2000. Professor Riles has been enormously influential in many, many fields of law, and particularly in my field of law. I'm an international lawyer, and I was actually just telling her now that an article that I read of hers in the International Comparative Law Quarterly, back when I was doing my PhD, totally changed the way I saw the work I was doing. It totally changed the way I saw what a Security Council resolution was. I mean, it really was kind of a wow moment for me. So I'm looking forward to more wow moments this evening. And she's going to talk to us about the sociality of the platform. So I'll shut up and stop being fangirlish now.
Thank you.
And hand the floor over to Professor Riles.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Professor Ruler, for that beautiful introduction, and thank you also to Dr. Delmar for this invitation, and of course to Professor Cotterell for being the inspiration for all of this. It's really great to be here, and of course I really appreciate you all coming out on this dark and stormy night, so to speak. So what I'm talking about today is part of a book project that I'm trying to finish up on collaboration. As a genre of human activity that seems to fascinate us a lot at the moment. And this particular chapter is about online interaction. As I got interested in this material, I got more and more fascinated by online interaction, and kind of came to appreciate, really, it should have been obvious, but how important this subject is, which hadn't quite hit my radar until I started talking to so many other people in fields from international law elsewhere who seem to be facing similar issues. So I think I'm embarking on a new project, mostly in Europe. Once this book is finished, it's going to focus on this a bit more. So that's just to say that this paper is sort of the bookend of one project, but I think just kind of the jumping off point for something else. And so I'm really eager to have the conversation we'll have later and hear about how this all resonates with things that you all may be working on, because I think I have a lot to learn. Okay, so 20 years ago, new digital technologies were heralded as the engines of a new era of public discourse, right? I mean, we heard a lot of talk from the US Supreme Court down to academics and commentators on the news and in popular culture and so on about how the internet was going to allow social activists to escape from the iron cage of bureaucracy And we would no longer be relying on old institutions for funding and logistics, but we would just be able to, we lost our pictures here. Does anyone know? Okay, that's strange. Okay, we would just be able to basically, the phrase that you saw in a lot of the literature was organizing without organizing, that you'd just be able to go online and find your clan, so to speak, and start working together. Or another phrase that we heard a lot was post-bureaucratic pluralism, this really hopeful world. And although there have been some Arab Springs, there's also been a lot of other stuff in the intervening times. Clearly, that hopeful image was not the whole picture. Far from bringing rationality to public discourse and enabling connections across political divides, I think we all know that digitized conversation has largely or often become a kind of free speech free-for-all, in which passions get radicalized and charismatic authority gets amplified, and it's become a space in which we see an ever greater balkanization of the public sphere rather than a coming together. And for their part, sociologists and anthropologists who've been studying these phenomena have focused on social media platforms like these that we all use, to really, in a quite critical vein, to talk about how these become what one anthropologist called sociality factories and markets, where users are engaged in laborers to produce content about themselves, to produce, as one anthropologist said, themselves as profiles organized by marketing standards. So really a kind of dark picture of this. Now, the legal studies debate, I think, tracks some of the same euphoria to pessimism. We had an early era of a lot of excitement. Yochai Benkler here was really excited, and some of his colleagues and a number of other legal scholars thought this was really going to change the game. But that excitement, although I guess Yochai still remains fairly optimistic, upbeat about the internet. On the whole, I would say most of the literature has turned quite pessimistic. So you have people like Cass Sunstein and Jack Balkin now really concerned about how digital speech is impacting citizenship and culture and so forth. And so the focus has, in the legal debate, now seems to be on implications of all of this for the regulation of speech, right? So should we start to think about regulating online speech, and if so, how should we do it? And to boil a very complex and many-faceted debate down into a bumper sticker, basically there are two main positions. There's a libertarian type position that says, no, speech is an end in itself, even if it's garbage, even if it's hateful, even if it's damaging. It's sort of like religion. You have to allow it. You have to have it. On the one hand, and on the other side, a more Republican or deliberation-focused democratic view that says, well, no, speech is a means to an end. It's an end to self-government, to collective self-determination, and we should evaluate these new digital, these forms of digital speech to see whether they're promoting those values or not. So in that view, and this would be Sunstein in particular, right, that some speech can have a silencing effect on others, and so if it's taking away others' dignity or preventing them from speaking, perhaps we need regulation. And so Jack Balkin has said, our goal should be to create citizens, not consumers, that many of these sites seem to be producing consumers, not citizens. So the debate, in other words, is really not that different from the free speech debate we had all along outside the digital space, just sort of with the same people making the arguments and transposing them into a digital space. And social theorists who follow the legal debate have had a lot of critiques of the way that law professors are talking about digital speech. So Judith Butler has said, you know, you legal scholars, you're really presupposing a particular kind of subject when you talk about speech and speakers and listeners in the first place, which isn't very interesting. And this is Talal Asad, who's a very important anthropologist of the Orient as a concept, if you like, who has said, you know, he's pointed to the European choice to allow defamation of the Prophet Muhammad, say in France, and has said this takes away people's humanity and uses freedom of speech as a kind of cultural dogma through which certain people are treated as outcasts. So his idea is really to point to the fact that that this legal debate is missing something important about what's going on, if you like, in the soup, the larger environment in which it occurs. So I think what they're trying to say is that sometimes law professors lack a certain self-consciousness about the cultural foundations of our preoccupation with free speech. I guess I would add a couple of other things to their critique, which is it's interesting that the examples that both Butler and Assad use, and most of the others that I could find who comment on law professors use, most of the examples are transnational. He's talking about speech that's regulated in France that has an impact elsewhere in the world, right? And so one of the things that I think a more socio-legal studies approach puts on the table is how citizenship, if that's the issue, is not just being produced in one locale. It's being produced globally, so to speak. And that seems to be missing from the way most of the law professors talk about this. The other thing that I think we could ask ourselves is the focus on state regulation, which is so prevalent in the legal debate, entirely warranted? What does that miss, right? The question that law professors are asking is, should speech on the internet be regulated, by states, is the implication, right? By governments. And so there's nothing wrong with focusing on states. States are good. We all make a living talking about state regulation. But what do you not see in this story when you focus entirely on states or when you think about these issues as pretty domestic? So what I'd like to do tonight is kind of get us to start thinking about whether there might be other ways to think about digital deliberation that raise totally different regulatory or ethical challenges. And so that's a big question, and we can just start and hopefully have a discussion about that going forward. So let me just say a couple words about how I'm going to approach this. So I am an anthropologist as well as a legal scholar. And so for those of you who are not very familiar with what that means, I would just kind of boil it down to say that I look at problems in a particular way that may be a little unusual or unfamiliar. I think of it as a kind of inductive approach where you begin with participant observation in a specific case, and you try to really see and understand on its own terms, first of all, what people are doing and saying, even if at first it's strange or repulsive to you. And more than just understanding it, you ask yourself whether or not there's anything that can be learned or borrowed onto your own intellectual terrain from the space in which you're working as an anthropologist. So you kind of think comparatively, if you like, from the inside out, beginning with a case, thinking inductively about that case, building theory inductively, and then thinking about other cases. So that's what I'm going to do. And I want to add one more thing, which is that in the last 10 years, something really interesting has been happening in anthropology, pushed by a couple of trends. One is feminist anthropology, in which feminist anthropologists have really been interested in not just, going back to the 60s and 70s, not just recently, but been interested in the relationships that one builds with one's ethnographic subjects and realizing that those relationships are important for their own sake. And then the next step in feminist theory was to say, sometimes the result of creative intellectual work in the field isn't even a text. It could be a relationship, or it could be an activist project, or it could be an institution building project or something else. And then a similar movement coming out of science studies and the introduction of science studies into anthropology, in which anthropologists found themselves doing participant observation, but getting closer and closer and closer to the point where they said, why don't we just collaborate with our subjects? And instead of just writing texts, which we still can do, what about engaging in experiments? Experiments being the language of science. Experiments to try to make something happen in the world as kind of intervention. So it's kind of, if you like, a post, Latour wrote an interesting paper, Bruno Latour, about what comes after critique. And I would say one of the things that this movement is about is sort of post-critique moment in which rather than just doing description or critique, we also might be engaging in collaborative experiments. Okay, so that's just to explain the background of what I'm doing in case you're confused. You may still be confused, but thought it might be a little bit helpful. Okay, so now let me just go into then the example that I want to give you, and then we'll reason from the inside out. Okay, so in 2011, I was finishing up fieldwork for the project that was just mentioned here about legal reasoning in the global financial markets. And of course, in March 2011, we had a terrible earthquake followed by a tsunami, and then followed, of course, by a devastating nuclear accident at Fukushima. And a lot collapsed along with those walls on that day. I was working with people in the financial markets, regulators, titans of the financial industry, academics, very powerful, esteemed academics as well. And my informants suffered a real crisis of confidence in their own expertise as a result of this incident, in which people started saying, how could this happen here in Japan? We thought we were a safe country. We thought our regulatory systems worked. We thought this wasn't Indonesia. One person said to me, and I have to say that I also experienced a lot of the same emotion. I realized I hadn't thought very much about all the nexus of contracts that I was invoking when I flipped a switch, for example. What were all the implications of that? I had to admit that the crisis at Fukushima, which was a result of the failure of a certain kind of knowledge, what people talked about as the nuclear village, a sort of silo thinking within the community of people who made policy around these issues, that this failure of knowledge was in part a failure of the academy. It had a dimension in the universities in which I was a part, so it wasn't just something out there. And so as I suddenly found myself in these really difficult and frankly painful conversations with people about the larger existential implications of this, the failure of expertise, we began to feel that we really needed to find some way to retool, or at least to live side by side the space of our questions about the limits of our confidence in our own expertise. And I think this was, in retrospect, a piece of a wider cultural moment that we're now living out, which has to do with the crisis of expertise and populism and so forth. But a piece of a moment in which there is an increasing loss of faith in international institutions, in science, in transnational institutions that are meant to resolve problems like the environmental crisis or the regulation of industries and so forth. And so the question was, what else could we do? And so we started having a number of discussions, first just over email, and this grew and grew. And now we have over 1,000 members. We organized ourselves into a group called Meridian 180. This is our old, a slide from our very, very early stuff. But Meridian 180, which is the 180th meridian, which is the dividing line between east and west. Also, it's the opposite of the Greenwich Meridian. If you know anything about sailors' lore, maritime law, you might know that when ships cross the 180th meridian, the sailors experience all kinds of strange dreams. They talk about standing on their heads. It's a place where you think things differently. You have upside down thoughts. And so we thought this is a perfect name for us. It's both the divide between East and West and this space of rethinking. And so we started with a number of online forums. We now have over 1,000 members in over 35 countries. 6 offices run by different universities around the world are supporting this. I guess from the beginning, the idea here was, could we have an experiment in a kind of online sociality that would not be Facebook? That was the ambition. And so we thought, what are the structural features that we'd like to have? The first was that we wanted conversations to be multilingual. We wanted to break down the hegemony of English. And we also thought that actually inserting translation would create this time lag in which that would introduce seriousness into the discussion, that if people felt that their words were being translated, that there was labor at stake in producing this text, that it would induce a kind of seriousness to the conversation. We thought that the conversations should be private, unlike the sort of public nature of the internet, to change the character of the speech. We thought the members should be carefully chosen as people who were really at the top of their game, but also had a kind of creativity and willingness to experiment. And we thought it was important, of course, that it be not-for-profit, funded by universities, kind of with money cobbled together, even if we couldn't grow as much, that the idea was that it was important to keep it out of the market in some way. And finally, we really worked on having a sort of diffuse transnational governance structure that was very egalitarian, in which people from different walks of life, different fields, and of course different nationalities could input into this. Now, for the first 3 years of this project, here, just because everyone always asks, so here's who the kind of breakdown of what the membership looks like. So you can see what kind of fields are represented. And then here's a list of the first 40 online discussions that we had, and you can see there's everything up there from tax policy to the meaning of happiness, so really kind of a broad division. Now, for the first 3 years of this project, we really didn't know how to describe it. Whenever anybody said, well, what is it? We all would kind of have this panic moment, kind of like when somebody asks you as a graduate student what your dissertation is about, you just don't want to be asked that question. We couldn't describe what this really was. And we kept looking for a word or phrase to explain what this project was about. So we, some of the ideas that were thrown out were amateur think tank, or guerrilla consulting group, or somebody said black box theater performance, or my personal favorite, intellectual gym, in which you could just go to kind of work your intellectual muscles side by side with strangers and then leave. But it became increasingly a serious problem. How do you explain what this is? And so in 2016, we had a meeting of some of the leaders of the group in which we spent an entire weekend kind of trying to figure out how to describe this thing. And after hours and hours of this just excruciating conversation, somebody said, we're a platform. And this rustle of excitement went through the group, and everybody thought, yeah, we're a platform. And one guy, this guy right here, who is a venture capitalist in the tech industry, kept saying, we're a platform, we're a platform, we're a platform, as if as soon as you say that, it sounds really serious. He was trying it on in different voices, and whoops, sorry, let me just go back here. And the idea was that that just sounded right to him. It sounded right because it conveyed both like a seriousness, everyone would understand what it is, and total open-endedness, such that you never had to explain exactly what you were because you were a platform. So this is interesting, right? Why the platform? Why did that work when Black Box Theater or Intellectual Gym or other things didn't work? What is it about the platform? So being an ethnographer, I did ask at that moment, I noticed that this was happening, and so I did start asking questions. Well, why does this seem like the right term to us? And people gave the following answers. Platforms are different from institutions. Institutions are older, less flexible, more locally grounded, where platforms rely on new information technologies to cross distances and borders of all kinds, was one of the things that somebody explained. Another person said, platforms are distinct from communities. We don't want to be called a community or a collective, or God forbid, like some sort of, something that has a right or a left association with it, like a kibbutz or something. No, a platform is just objective. A platform also is a modality it's got a technical dimensions, and it brings together differences, somebody said. But this is a diagram, by the way, that was produced by the design, I'm sure you have these people at your university, so like the design people who produce brochures for you, right? So he produced this picture of what we were, and I just think it's fascinating, right? You could see it mixing things of all different kinds. So bringing together differences, different kinds of expertise, different language groups, different political orientations can be brought together by filtering and organizing conversations that otherwise would be unruly or impossible. So This is a slide produced by the venture capitalist who was trying to help us out, in various ways. And you can see his image here that basically it's a pipeline of ideas. There's all this stuff floating around, what is happiness or whatever, and it gets filtered down through the platform into this gold nugget like outputs, ebooks, publications, policy papers. So this idea, it's an amazing tool as well as a form of social organization. And what's interesting is that what a platform is for remains completely open-ended. You don't have to say it's a platform for achieving X. As long as you say you're a platform, it seems like it's a real thing. But as such, the open-ended quality is interesting. It's future-oriented. You're building a platform to do something in the future that remains kind of underdeveloped. So point number one I want to make tonight is just this idea of the platform. Let's just notice it as a sort of phenomenon of this moment. Why a platform? Why the platform? I'm sure many of you are part of a million platforms. I'm sure in the fields that you study, you're finding this concept popping up all over the place. It seems to be emerging as an important model of social organization, something that captures people's imaginations. And as such, like any other institution that sociolegal scholars should study, maybe we should be giving it some attention. Just to give you a scary example of this, on Friday, I had a meeting with the person in the German Ministry of Education who authorizes and funds all the German universities, so a very powerful bureaucrat. And he described to me universities as platforms. He said they're basically platforms for producing knowledge and training people, and the question then becomes, how do we hook these platforms up? And it's like making the pipes connect with each other. We got to get them hooked up. And he was really just so excited about this idea of the university as a platform. And we might want to think about what is the implication of that image as opposed to a different one. All right, one way of kind of getting some intellectual purchase on this might be to compare it to another form like this that I spent a lot of time studying before, which is the network. So this is an earlier book. You can see how old the typeface is from years ago. Years ago, the form that seemed to capture people's attention was the network. Everybody was networking. Everyone was in a network. And I wrote about networks as a phenomenon of international law. And there was a lot of euphoria about networks, too. They were going to bring about global social movements and human rights and all the good stuff. And in some ways, networks and platforms are similar. Both are imagined to cross geographical distances. Both are supposed to be alternatives to old things like institutions. They're supposed to be flexible, nimble, and all of that. But there are differences, too, because as people talked to me about networks 20 years ago, networks were imagined to be kind of sui generis, like it was always, you wanted to pretend your networks just kind of happened. Oh, I was just networking with some people and we developed a network. And a lot of the socio-legal turn was to say, well, wait a minute, behind all this kind of sui generis networking is a lot of funding, a lot of documents, a lot of work, a lot of labor and money and institutional work has to go into creating these networks. So that's one difference. Here, in contrast, the platform is all about that. There's nothing to uncover there. It's pointing to that, saying, oh, it's all about technology. Look at our technological infrastructure. So the infrastructural quality of the platform seems to be a big difference. That's one. The second difference, I would say, is that when people talked about networks back in the day, they thought of them as something that were infinitely extensible. They wanted to say a network, anyone can be in my network. The networks just can get bigger and bigger. They can get global. Everyone can be included. And so a lot of the critical work that people like me was doing was showing, look at your picture. Actually, it's not open. It's closed. Well, now the platform actually presents itself, I think, and we could talk more about whether you agree, but as already closed. The platform is not for everybody. Some people are in the platform and some people aren't, and it doesn't apologize for that. So it kind of speaks to a darker worldview that has lost faith in the idea that everyone and anyone can be brought into the conversation. You already, by definition, are excluding some people, and you feel fine about that. Okay, so given all this, let's go back to free speech now. So as anthropologists know, legal anthropologists know, one of the best ways to describe norms and social processes is to look at a case of conflict. So I'm going to tell you a story about a conflict that happened within Meridian 180 in which the kind of Facebook-style free speech world touched our platform and how we resolved it, and we could talk about what it means. So about 3 years into the project, we had young translators. They were postdocs and young professors from different countries around the world, and they were working together, and they had this cohort they were the Young Turks in the project, and they came to the old fogies like me and said, you guys say that you want to have this big open dialogue and really engage with people who are different from yourselves, but look at the network. It's all people who think alike. You're all a bunch of kind of left-wing like people. If you really mean what you say, why don't you invite some of the people who bother you so much into this group? Why don't you invite some sort of right-wing nationalists, types, and then we'll see how it goes. So I took the bait, the challenge, and as it so happened, through my law school alumni networks, you meet all kinds of people through law school alumni networks, I was introduced to the ideal candidate, a high-ranking member of the political staff of the U.S. Republican coalition in the U.S. Congress. And this was someone who was directly responsible for making U.S. policy towards Asia, who held both a law degree and a doctorate in political science focusing on Chinese security policy. And he had been a former Navy commander, which is very prestigious, and he claimed to be a Zen monk to boot. This was just too good to be true, so we had to invite him in. So we invited this guy in, and the first few posts that he made were exactly as expected, erudite, interesting, reasonable, et cetera, et cetera. And then after a few months, in the middle of, apropos nothing, kind of all of a sudden, he launched into this attack on the corrupt and oligarchic nature of the Chinese state and the fact that all of the Chinese who were in our group, we have a big group of quite a number of Chinese scholars, all the Chinese groups were on the Chinese government payroll, so everything they said was basically garbage anyway, and why are we even talking to these people? Now, remarkably, nothing like this had ever happened before, and actually hasn't happened since, so we can think about what that means. But on the core idea group, which is the leadership group of the project, there was a Chinese scholar, kind of critical theory person based at a US law school, and he really panicked when this happened. He was really afraid that this was going to make our Chinese members really uncomfortable, that it would play into certain suspicions that people always have, that a project like this is actually covert, covertly funded by the U.S. government and is part of an effort to undermine Chinese sovereignty and so forth, and that the Chinese members, while they might actually agree with some of the critiques of the Chinese state, would feel that they would have to withdraw from the project because of this comment. There were 3 anthropologists also in that core idea group. What bothered us was something slightly different. What bothered us was that it didn't seem like this guy was trying to engage. He was saying these things about our Chinese members, but didn't really seem to be talking to them or giving them a chance to respond. And so the incident exposed, we thought, in its violation, a deeply committed, held norm of the platform we'd never articulated, which was that you had to be talking to people, not about them or at them. So the group asked me to call him up and ask him if he would change his posts. I should say the reason this came to our attention is kind of interesting. It's because the translators would receive the post first, and they got this, and they looked at it, and they flagged it as a possibly problem and then brought it to us. So it had never gone up on the platform yet. So I phoned him up, and I asked him, and we could be critical of this. I think in retrospect it's kind of interesting that I would do this. But I asked him to visualize being in a room with our Chinese colleagues and asked him if he would have said things in the same way if he had been there face to face. So we could ask ourselves why I thought an analogy to a real conversation is the right one. It probably isn't, but anyway, that's what I did. And he responded swiftly and angrily. In his view, this was a matter of free speech, and he told me he had a right to say what he wanted to say, and he didn't want to participate in the habit of US sinologists in what he called self-censorship in order to avoid offending Chinese sensibilities. And he accused me of anti-US bias, which he felt was rampant in the American Academy, and then said, I participate in 6 or 7 listservs where Chinese members spout nationalist propaganda, and I'm expected to behave like a gentleman. And at that point, I wondered what had happened to his Zen training, but anyway. And so when we ended the call, he made just a couple of very minor revisions, but basically resubmitted his post defiantly. Now, within its logic, what this person was saying made perfect sense. It's the libertarian view that we started with, right? The idea that good or bad, destructive or not, that free speech is an end in itself and people should have a right to make it. And so this triggered a kind of intensive debate among the core idea group about what to do. And in the end, we felt that our core norm, the problem forced us to articulate to ourselves what the norms of the platform were. And we decided that one of our core norms was in taking risks. And so we felt that it was important to take a risk, and so we let the post go forward, with the appreciation that perhaps we might lose our Chinese membership over it. Now, what happened next was totally unexpected to me. I really never imagined that this would happen, which was that other members stepped in. So a Korean economist deftly turned the conversation to another subject. But most importantly, our Chinese members participated actively, but completely ignoring his comments. So they made this big effort to post a lot of comments about other topics, entirely ignoring him altogether. And so what they did was kind of just turn his fireworks into a dud, if you like. It went nowhere. And as I talked with our young postdocs, who were just delighted by this event, as you can imagine, about this, our Chinese postdoc, who was a professor in China and was in the group, a young professor in China, said that he really disagreed with the senior Chinese scholar on the core idea group about how dangerous this was. He said, young Chinese scholars have heard all this kind of rhetoric from Americans before, and in fact, they probably agree with a lot of the sentiment. But the important thing is they know how to ignore certain online conversation in order to focus on what they really care about, which is being part of this intellectual community. And then he gave this really interesting analogy. He said, it's like, when you see a bunch of pornography on the internet, you know how to ignore it to focus on what you want to focus on, which I think is really interesting in terms of free speech. So how do we interpret this episode from the point of view of the legal debate about free speech in digital space? Well, this speech was not regulated, if you think of us as the regulators of this community. It was not regulated as the communitarians would prefer. But as a libertarian intervention, it also failed because the speech turned out to be beside the point. And it was, if you like, sanctioned in the cruelest ways, which is that it was just ignored. So how do we explain this? And what does it tell us about how else, as socio-legal scholars, what we might want to think about online sociality? I think in order to answer this, we need to go back to what was most exciting about the platform concept for the participants themselves, which was the infrastructure, the idea of a platform as a socio-technical infrastructure, something to do something on. So let me just go, if you like, take you behind the speech now to the infrastructure itself. So this group is, of course, founded on an infrastructure. There's a digital platform created at Cornell initially for multilingual online conversation. It was originally built by a kind of local artisanal software company in the hippie capital of America, Ithaca, New York, where I used to live. Supervised by this guy who was an out-of-work historian of the Middle Ages, working on this as a kind of fun project. And it was this really rickety technology that eventually completely fell apart. And last year, as an enormous project that involved all of the members and a lot of staff, we created a brand new platform. Sounds like a dumb thing, but it occupied everybody's energy in terms of fundraising and solving the legal problems raised by this platform, the IP issues, the branding issues, the organizational problems, the staffing problems, et cetera, to create a new fancy platform. So why do I tell you this? My point is that this digital speech is hardly organizing without organizing, in the language of the early euphoria about internet speech. It's actually a whole bureaucracy behind the platform doing a lot of work in quite traditional ways. And also, in contrast to the image you might have of magical technology that just allows people to speak foreign languages to one another, it's actually a world full of constant glitches, rickety technologies that are breaking down. And not just the technologies, but turf battles or misunderstandings, people to hire and fire, meetings missed due to time zone errors, emails intercepted in spam filters, technologies that don't engage people or people can't figure out how to make them work, or that break down altogether. So my point here is that rather than seeing this as just something that happens, you have to see these technologies, the back end, as technologies that have needs. And these needs give people, real people, something to do. And that it becomes the ground for social relations. In particular, when one looks as a sociologist or an anthropologist at the back end of this platform, what you discover is that Meridian 180 as a platform, and I would guess this is generalizable to most platforms, actually has two sides to it. So there's the dialogue side that we've been talking about, where the members talk about ideas, but there's a back end. And in fact, it's instantiated in the technology. The back end, the staff, the people who do all the work use a different platform altogether. This is called Basecamp, a platform for sharing files, for sending each other messages, for assigning to-dos to each other. This is a platform that the members of Meridian 180 don't even know exists, right? So they're not even aware of all this work going on the back end to host them. So I want to think about this word hosting, right? We call this hosting, both technologically and if you think sociologically, but hosting is also a really important anthropological term from the anthropology of the gift, so let's think a little bit about that. So how does this relationship between the back end, the hosts, if you like, the staff, and the front end, the members, really work? Well, the staff, it's like a cat and mouse game. The staff are continually trying to engage the members, to get them to participate in the platform through technology. So for example, the staff decided that professors are really not good at conversation because they drone on too long, and in particular they always cite their own work or like copy and paste from their text into this and just promote themselves, and that's not a conversation. So what to do? Well, they came up with the idea of baking into the technology something that after a certain number of characters would like delete your post, right? So you've seen this, right? So over a certain number of characters and sorry, your post is too long, you know. And then of course that raised all kinds of further technological problems because is a character the same in Chinese as it is in English language, you can imagine. But then you can imagine in return, how the members fight back, right? So the staff is very proud of themselves. They've found a technical solution to creating a norm, right? What does the academics do? Anybody can guess? They just put multiple posts, right? So you know, there are these games that we play through technology to both regulate one another and subvert regulation. Likewise, the staff is always trying to engage members and get them excited about topics, so they come up with all kinds of email blasts or ways to, you know, try to show up in your inbox and make sure that that email doesn't get caught in your spam folder. I mean, this is the main thing that they focus on, how to get your attention through the technology. But of course, the members can just ignore those emails or not open them and so on. And so what I'm trying to say is that baked into this technology is a lot of power, a lot of authority, a lot of agency, you know, stuff that we're used to studying from a socio-legal point of view. And actually, these are two quite separate groups. So here's a nice little test of how, if you like, this platform actually splits into two sides, the hosts and let's say the guests, the members. On one occasion, I asked one of our staff members, there was a conversation going online, I asked her to summarize that conversation and post the summary. And she looked at me with a tone of absolute, you know, like I had violated norm, and she said, "That's not my job." And what she meant by that is that's for you, the academics, to do. All I do is I prepare the space, and then you go do the intellectual work. So this idea, it's a different world, a different side of the job. That said, the members have a tremendous they have an awareness of the amount of labor involved in this platform, and that labor becomes a subject of quite a lot of fascination. So I quickly found out that one of the fastest ways to excite the members at a live event was to bring our young postdoc translators to the conferences. The members wanted to see who was the person who had translated their words into Chinese, and to meet that person and to find out who the real person was behind the technology. And so the sort of fascinating, who are these mysterious people who host us? So you know, as I said, hosting is something that anthropologists think a lot about. Let's see, this is many of you, I'm sure, know the work of Marcel Mauss. I bring it up here because he was writing in a time that in many ways is very similar to our own, time of rising nationalism, of inward lookingness, of political extremes, sort of duking it out in the public sphere. And Mauss said that his own ethical response to that moment would be to go back to first principles and survey what was all the ethnological literature at that time in the 20s, and ask himself, what is the basic building block of human ethics? Where does it begin? What is universal here? And he said, the basic building block is giving a gift to someone else, and then miraculously, that person returning the gift in turn. Reciprocity. The reciprocity is the fundamental building block, the universal, the starting point. And he said from there it gets a lot more complicated. You know, it gets quickly, you get into generalized reciprocity. You eventually get something like our modern tax code, which is a kind of anonymous form of reciprocity. He says we finally ultimately come to call this justice. But if you get at its core, what it is giving a gift to someone else and having them return it. And one of the important things, as he pointed out about gifts, is they always entail taking a risk. There's vulnerability involved. Why? Because when I give a gift to you, I don't know how you're going to respond. You may refuse my gift. You may ridicule my gift. You may misuse it or just waste it or ignore it altogether. So there's always a risk involved. And one further thing, you can't give a gift to yourself. Right? By definition, you can only give a gift to someone who is defined as in some way a foreigner to you. So the basics of ethics, really, if you like, is the act of giving something to someone who is in some sense foreign to you, engaging with foreignness in a spirit of vulnerability. Okay. So if I were to have a critique of our Navy commander Zen guru guy, it wouldn't be that his political views are not mine or any of that. It would be that this is where he fails, that there is no vulnerability in the position that he's taking, that it looks outrageous, but there's actually no risk-taking because he's not speaking to the people that he's speaking about. He's not really engaging them. Even though it seems brave and, you know, kind of, you know, transcend, you know, sort of breaking barriers, breaking norms or what have you. So then we could ask, from a Maussian point of view, where was the risk in this episode? If it wasn't in the speech that guy made, what risks mattered? What kinds of risks mattered in this platform? As a way of getting at what are its ethics, what are norms, how do we think about the socio-legal quality of the platform? So I think that as I've talked to people about this incident and about why they responded the way they did, what I've heard again and again is that they perceived the comment as a risk to the survival of the platform itself. That they saw this person's behavior as perhaps tearing down a project that they cared about. And when they stepped in, it wasn't to say something specific, substantive in response. It was to try to protect the platform. And so what you had here was the members reading that post not as a threat to a particular political point of view that they might hold, but rather as a threat to the platform and its future. And so then you could ask, why do they care? Why were they committed? Why did they want to save this thing? Why did they respond in that way? And I think that what they would say is, so much labor had gone into building this. So much had been given. And I wanted to give something back. I wanted to do what I could to protect this thing. So what I'm trying to say here is we thought that Meridian 180 was special because we had certain people involved and not others. We thought it was because we had certain topics, the quality of the speech, the quality of the members. But what I've learned from this incident, in fact, was that it was special because of the commitment and work that goes into creating the platform itself. In other words, the relevant foreigner here wasn't the foreigner right-wing person, it wasn't the foreigner someone from another culture or language group or any of that. It was the distance between the staff who were hosting something for the members, and the members, the academics, who were then in turn responding to the gift from the staff. Okay, so I'll conclude and then we can have a conversation. Legal scholars are thinking a lot about the effects of new digital forms of speech on existing polities right now. What I think they're ignoring is perhaps the more interesting and radical phenomenon of emerging forms of social organization that don't fit into the boxes of states or international organizations or even cultures or communities, and that just might be displacing those in terms of people's commitments. That this might be that there are new forms of collectivity that people feel even more committed to that need to be at the focus of the way we think about what gets our attention. And the platform seems to be one of those things, something people can commit to across national boundaries, as in this example, across jurisdictions, displacing the state in terms of people's commitments, perhaps. But more importantly, I want to suggest that a focus on speech alone misses something really important, which is sociality, platform sociality. Contestation, hierarchy, agency, power, creativity at work in building these things and sustaining them. And there's a lot of traditional law and action research to be done on forms of regulation like shaming or shunning, in this example, at work in all of that sociality. This is something perhaps more consequential as a socio-technical phenomenon than the category of speech can capture. So rather than focus on how to square the circle between freedom of speech on the one hand and dignity and equality of access on the other, maybe we first need to start by understanding online sociality and the kinds of social commitments they generate. For example, we could have a conversation now, if you like, about a platform like Facebook, for example, which has an entirely different organizational structure to it, a different economy to it, a totally different space in which I would say, if I had a critique of Facebook, is that little is risked in that space, except in investment terms, in terms of the market logic of creating this platform to make money. But for those of us who use it, Facebook's instrumentalization of friendship is precisely the opposite of the risk that I've described. It's really about accumulation, having more and more friends and so on, but not taking a risk in Mosian terms. And so if we wanted now to think from a normative point of view about online communities of this kind, I think it would be interesting to think with Mos, who of course also is very important for thinking about non-state law and non-state communities, right? About the evolving ethics of online sociality and to start asking questions about where are people taking risks or not taking risks? What kinds of gifts are being made to what kinds of foreigners in these spaces? What are the conditions that might make it possible for risks to be taken, or for gifts to be made in return? For example, in this example that I gave you, regulation, stopping the speech, would have deprived the members of an opportunity to step in, to make evident their commitment to the future of the platform. On the other hand, we can imagine other cases in which perhaps regulation creates the very zone in which risks can be taken. So there's space for a normative debate about the ethics of these platforms in terms of of the possibility of risk taking. But in any case, my point here tonight is really just to draw attention to this and open a space for us to begin to think about what the building blocks of an analysis might be. So I welcome your thoughts and examples of other cases and criticisms and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So we're lucky enough to be able to ask some questions. Do bear in mind that there are drinks outside afterwards, and everybody is very welcome to join us there as well. So there'll be chance for more informal questions too. Does anybody have a question, burning question right now?
Oh, excellent.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating talk. I was thinking when you were talking about MOS that there's another aspect to the gift, giving of gift and receiving it, which is that the gift giver actually has, in many cases, considerable power over the person who receives the gift.
Yes.
And you see that in the potlatch, obviously.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so you kind of emphasise reciprocity as a really important thing that comes out of it. But I was thinking about the power aspect as well. And then taking that to the platform, I was thinking, how do power relationships work out in the platform in terms of whose speech within it actually comes to dominate? Or do you have a way of preventing that happening? And I'm thinking about real life things where on internet conversations, obviously, and social networks, some kinds of speech really dominate and other kinds don't. So is that an issue that has come up?
So you're absolutely right. So very important that I should be clear, reciprocity doesn't mean equality. Reciprocity can be very hierarchical, right? And so, but sometimes the hierarchies can be puzzling, right? So in theory, at least, the members of this group who are academics or high-level policymakers or so on would be in a higher status position vis-a-vis the staff who are junior translators and secretaries and so on. But as you suggest, the one who's giving the gift, who's setting it up, doing all the labor, has a lot of power over the other. So here you see the staff having quite a lot of power over those big academics, and helps us to see that the hierarchies sometimes are not what you expect them to be. But yeah, I mean, I think sometimes I think anthropologists forget that people outside of anthropology don't know that when we say gift, we don't mean like something like friendly, like a present. It can be quite violent, quite awful. Now, in terms of people dominating, you know, interestingly, it hasn't been really a problem for us. This is the only incident that I can think of where something like that happened. And there are two possible theories. One is it's just we've chosen a remarkable group of incredibly charming people who are just happen to be sweethearts, and it's just nirvana. That's one possibility. I don't think that's it. I think there's something about the time lag. I think there are socio-technical things you can do to address some of these problems. So there's something about the time lag. If I post my comment, I have to wait for these postdocs to translate it. I know they're going to translate it, and then it's going to these other people who I really respect. People seem to feel, I hear again and again, it's so intimidating, it's so scary. I wouldn't really know what to say, or if someone's going to spend a whole day translating my ideas. And so there's a level of a lot of self-censorship going on, and I think maybe I wish they'd take more risks. So perhaps that makes me think that perhaps Facebook's model, or some of these models of technology, are actually meant in the reverse way to make us behave badly online. We had a big debate about whether we should have a like button. On Facebook, there's a thing where you could like somebody's comment, because the idea was translation's too expensive, it takes too long. And if you want to say somebody said something good, you have to just write, this was a really brilliant idea, and then someone has to translate it. Why don't we just have a like button, and then we'll know, we can count up how many times somebody likes it or not. And we really thought no, because that's a different modality of speech, right? It encourages people to try to say things to get attention, so to speak. And so, so perhaps there are things we can do to address that.
Any more questions? Now you've had a little bit longer to think.
Yeah, lots of questions. Good.
So I'm very high up, so
we can see you fine. Yeah. Wave, hello. Yes. Exactly right.
Thanks. That was really thought-provoking, and I think I have a couple of questions, but I think you touched upon them. But it's more prompting you maybe to articulate some of the wider implications of some of what you're saying. So my first question is, you're saying that one of the things is that what you observe doesn't really fit traditional categories of states and communities, etc. But also in a lot of what you were saying, actually, I felt that they reproduce a lot of the dynamics that we see. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about also what kind of dynamics are in fact reproduced in these platforms that don't necessarily map onto our conceptual categories. And the other question is that because you began by saying that you try to sort of lawyers have only been looking at the impacts of digital speech on citizenship, and that you want to sort of move away from that and sort of ask what's lost in some of the way we approach these questions. Not that I work on this area, but we as but I do wonder actually, can you come back to this question more specifically with your frame? Because it seems to me that they don't map onto but maybe something then gets lost also within the existing notions of citizenship and politics, and it sounded to me that these become more apolitical spaces actually, and then maybe something is in fact lost, and we should go back actually to these questions also and ask ourselves about the implications.
Right, great, thank you. No, actually, I think your 2 points sort of go together to me. So great point, actually, that there's a lot that's very traditional about these spaces. And a few anthropologists of the internet have talked about this, how bureaucratic these projects quickly become in a very traditional Weberian way, right? It has all the features of Weberian bureaucracy, and that is absolutely true. It's certainly my experience of it. It feels very traditional. And in fact, I found also, I've noticed that when people try to solve problems, as I did in saying to the guy, imagine you're in a room with someone. What you tend to do is analogize to spaces that you know, and then you borrow the norms and processes from those spaces into the digital space, which then, of course, reproduces those, right? So I think that's a really, really great observation about it. So I was, in saying that we're too focused on citizenship and so on, what I wanted to say is that the citizenship debate assumes that our primary point of identification is or should be with the nation state, right? And the question is what to do, what are the features of that identification, what rights and duties and affective dimensions should there be to that, right? That's the citizenship debate. I think it's interesting that we all are getting more and more committed to a variety of other forms of sometimes transnational engagement like this, and that it does take up some of your affective space, you know, to do this, which is taken away from other things. And so perhaps if these become important communities, just like we talked about, you know, culture is important once, we talked about transnational social movements, we need to start thinking about these other spaces emerging as alternatives to the state as a source of commitment. But then your point then, to your first point is, well, but if they turn out to borrow a bunch of the stuff, then can't we study them in much the same way, I take, right, as we studied the state, which is to talk about politics and to talk about all the other things we might want to talk about. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of good old-fashioned traditional socio-legal work to be done on these spaces, which would include all the questions that you raised. And what's been a surprise to me about it is just how much a traditional toolkit has to offer, which I think is not the self-presentation of this stuff as totally alternative and new and out of the box and completely different, right? So, yeah.
Any more? Max?
Unless there are other. Yeah, well, there's 2 questions about people maybe still thinking. It was terrific, and I wanted to ask first about the role of emotion and affect, because I mean, one of the ways in which we could distinguish between forms of sociality is by the kinds of emotions that perhaps dominate them.
Right.
And at times, I mean, it sounded to me like at times this was very conscious. It was planned, or it was deliberate that what you would be aiming for example, in order to engage participation, would be to appeal to excitement. You mentioned appealing to excitement at one point. You mentioned appealing to risk-taking. So there's quite an interesting range of emotions. It's not appealing to guilt, for example.
Right.
It's
I hope not. Yeah.
Right. So one could see, So I wondered actually to what extent that was so, that this was part of what went into the design process, was a way of affective design, or about affording or nudging certain kind of emotional experiences.
Yeah.
That was one. The second was that a platform in some respects is, I mean, to my ears, it sounds like something that is, in some sense, is quite outward facing. You perform on a platform to someone in a way. No, you might think that way anyway. That you're on a platform and it's a platform for saying something to an audience. So I just wondered. You mentioned branding and logo and logos at one point. But I wondered what other aspects of this are outward facing. To whom do you think you are communicating, if you are at all, and what are the audiences?
Great questions. Okay, so here I think we need to think about, so let's start with the branding logo part. Why the branding, the logo? Okay, so there's a continual challenge to the survival of this project, which is that it doesn't fit with the university. So every time, you know, my dean hates it, at Cornell he hated it because it doesn't produce, you know, scholarly outputs of the kind that we're supposed to produce, you know, and he keeps saying, you know, you're a smart person, you know how to do publications, why aren't you doing publications? Like, because I don't want to, because I want to do this. And that doesn't make any sense, right? Or why, you know, every time we would organize these people and get them together, in order for them to get funding to have to come, we'd have to invent these ridiculous places for them to stand up and read a paper for 5 minutes so they could all say they had read a paper, because that's what you have to tick the box to get your funding at your institution. You know, so all these ways in which the university doesn't fit with this kind of stuff, right? And in a sense, that's intentional. These are largely a bunch of academics who want to get outside the university, so they can't be surprised when the university kind of strikes back and says you're outside the university, right? But there's this constant challenge of how to describe these kinds of forms in terms of existing institutional categories. And so the logo and all this stuff is a lot of effort to sort of claim we're an institution that has, you know, a legitimate space which is worthy of funding, which is our biggest problem, right? So the platform language is even an attempt to sound legitimate to those audiences, I think, because Guerrilla Consulting Group doesn't really cut it, or, you know, black box theater performance, you know, you can't say that. So I think your question to me raises a set of questions for observation about what is the relationship between a lot of these so-called alternative spaces and very traditional institutional structures, and how are they linked up, and how do they present? Are they symbiotic in relationship to one another or not? Are they? Is something like this? Is it a challenge to the university? Is it not? Does it remake the university or not? You know, we might want to think about that. Thank you. And yeah, emotion. You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, how do you? But that's something that's always fascinated me. Going back to the UN. I mean, you're working on the spaces, and spaces are incredible. I mean, one of the things that they do is they make us feel things, right? And within the boredom of international institutions, how do you manufacture emotion? That's one of the main challenges of international institutions, is to get, how do you create commitment, energy, passion for something in the midst of all the bureaucracy? And certainly we have that same challenge. And, you know, certainly, you know, platforms like Facebook and so on are really, really good at doing that. They know how to make us, how to make us addicted to it, and so there's a lot there. You're absolutely right. So.
Any more? Yeah, right at the back there.
Yeah. So, Professor Rice, so I've been following your work in the international financial markets, and then something else, and then this is a platform. So, what's so special about this platform in comparison to other platforms?
Right.
Other platforms such as, you know, traditionally we have United Nations, we have European Union, where we have institutions governing the way the platforms works. So in your platform, is it an experimental platform? Just here for your purpose of organizing such a platform, or is it a real life communication mechanism such as Facebook, LinkedIn? So secondly, I was late for your lecture. When I came into the room, you were talking about this communication between this naval commander and the Chinese participants. So certainly that naval commander isn't an anthropologist.
No.
I imagine he doesn't speak any other language than you.
Yeah, right.
So certainly someone with international global experience and speaking multi-languages like you certainly much more tolerant and much more balanced and have
Just a better person.
cooperative approach to interaction and for the common good. So what can be done regarding this naval commander in order to bring him into the fold? Let's have a cooperative approach.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I think that's a really important, your last point is really important, right? That the question is, how do we engage this guy, right? Is there a way to engage him? And one of the interesting, so I'll just engage in some self-criticism here. I saw him as a threat. I saw what he did as a threat, and I was concerned that it was going to ruin what we had so carefully built. About 3 weeks after this incident happened, I went to Korea and I ran into the actually Korean economist who had posted that comment, the first comment that sort of turned things in the other way. And he said, now we invite him to come to Korea. And his idea was, all right, okay, fine, so he's no longer a problem, but can he become an interlocutor? And he said, I really want to hear what he has to say, actually. And I really want to, he wasn't threatened at all. And what I thought was so interesting was that perhaps in a situation like that, different people have different subject positions. He's threatening to me partly because he's an American, he stands for everything I disagree with. I'm embarrassed by him at some level vis-a-vis my Chinese colleagues. I find it, just abhorrent. But my Korean colleague actually has no such baggage in relationship to this man. He just finds him a curious, exotic thing, and he would like to talk to him. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about a group like this, when you have a lot of different people with different positions and different relationships to an issue, is that perhaps they can do different work in relationship to that. And indeed, the Korean member invited this guy to write something for a book that they did, and they continued. And I don't know if he's, changed his mind about everything, but certainly they talk. And so maybe there's some possibility there. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Noam.
Thanks. So if you analyze the platform from a sociological point of view, mainly as an interface between person to person, which it of course is, but what I noticed, I thought that there is possibly another interface that was tacit, unspokenly present in your talk, and that is the interface between machine and person, between person and computer, for that matter. And you made some allusions to it, and I thought important allusions.
Yes.
For example, when you talked about the likes,
yes.
and how people respond to the technical possibility of likes, or the addictive quality of Facebook.
Yeah.
And all that seems to me another very important dimension. So I was wondering about the extent to which that could or is brought to the surface, as it were, and is made more explicit in your analysis and work. And here I think this is a place maybe where sociology could also get some help from psychology.
Interesting. Yeah.
Considerable.
Yeah, great point. So I've been engaging with those questions a lot in terms of the literature in science and technology studies, but maybe you're right, maybe psychology is also important. I also think there are a whole bunch of very practical new disciplines that don't rise to the level of supposedly real academic work that are interesting to engage. For example, there's a whole field of design in this area. People whose job it is to figure out how you set the margins and things on these websites so that people will spend more seconds in front of the platform, right? And they have techniques, and they are very engaged with psychology, but also with art theory and with typography, and it goes back to some of the early modernist stuff that you must be working on, right? So those fields are also really fascinating to me, and so the question of the interface between human and machine, and in terms of what grabs our attention, is a really important question. And I'm really interested also, is it the same everywhere? You know, one of the things, we've had a lot of issues around this relating to the different ways people use technologies in different countries. So, for example, in China, people use completely different platforms to communicate, right? They use this thing called Weibo, and it's got a different logic to it. And then in Korea, they've got yet another totally different thing. And making a platform that appeals to everybody is actually really hard. And even there are things that you would do on the one that you couldn't possibly do on the other, which are critical for one group or the other. So not assuming that this stuff is universal too is, I think, important. Thank you.
One last offer of questions. Anybody got a question? Otherwise, we will go and have some wine outside. No? Well, in
Thank
that
you.
case-
Thank you so much.
Well,
It's really good. Thank you.
Thank
It's
you
really.
so much.
Thank you.